You'll recall that in my opening speech, I argued that if God does not exist, then there is no ultimate meaning, no ultimate value, and no ultimate purpose in life. And in fact, Dr. diCarlo actually agrees with me on this. He says, of course, the idea of God matters, but he says, God himself doesn't matter because he doesn't exist. But the basic point is that it matters whether or not God exists. Whether or not you're a theist or an atheist makes a huge difference in terms of meaning, value, and purpose in life. And Dr. diCarlo hasn't given us any argument to show that God does not exist. He says, show me the evidence, and then perhaps I'll believe. Well, we're not here tonight to debate the evidence for the existence of God, but I'd like to invite him to come to my debate tomorrow night at the University of Toronto with Dr. James Brown on the question, does God exist? And I'll be laying out 5 arguments for God's existence, as well as answering any objections that Dr. Brown would care to raise. But tonight, we're asking whether or not it matters if God exists. And I don't think Dr. diCarlo has denied my first point, that if God does not exist, there is ultimately no meaning in life or the universe. Secondly, I argued if there's no God, there is no ultimate value in life. His response was to say, but compassion can be a proximate value, even if, as he admits, there is no ultimate value in life. Proximate value, that's just philosopher speak for relativism. It just means that for me, it may be valuable to be compassionate, but for somebody else, they needn't feel that way at all. It's purely relative. Let me expand on the modern evolutionary view of ethics from Steven Pinker at Harvard University. He writes, the scientific outlook has taught us that some parts of our subjective experience are products of our biological makeup and have no objective counterpart in the world. The tastiness of fruit, the scariness of heights, the prettiness of flowers are common features of our nervous system. And if our species had evolved in a different ecosystem, or we were missing a few genes, our reactions could go the other way. Now, he says, if the distinction between right and wrong is also a product of brain wiring, why should we believe it is any more real? And if it is just a collective hallucination, how could we argue that evils like genocide and slavery are wrong for everyone rather than just distasteful to us? And in fact, there is no way to argue that. On the atheistic view, there is no ultimate right or wrong. Everything becomes relative. J.P. Moreland, my colleague at Talbot, has written the following. He says, if there is no moral truth to be discovered, and I simply have to choose the moral point of view because that is the type of life that I find worthwhile for myself, then the decision is arbitrary. And the decision to be a Mother Teresa instead of a Hitler is not a rational decision at all. It is very much like the decision to go to McDonald's instead of Burger King. It's purely arbitrary. In fact, this has profound implications because whose values are you going to adopt? Whose are right, whose are wrong? Peter Haas, in his very interesting book, Morality After Auschwitz, asked the question, how could an entire society have willingly participated in a state-sponsored program of mass torture and genocide for over a decade without any serious opposition? And this is his answer. He says, far from being contemptuous of ethics, the perpetrators acted in strict conformity with an ethic, which held that however difficult and unpleasant the task might have been, mass extermination of the Jews and Gypsies was entirely justified. The Holocaust was possible only because a new ethic was in place that did not define the arrest and deportation of Jews as wrong, and in fact defined it as ethically tolerable and even good. And what Haas goes on to point out is that because of its internal coherence and consistency, the Nazi ethic could not be discredited from within. Only from a transcendent vantage point could one say that society's system of values was objectively wrong, a transcendent vantage point which is noticeably lacking on an atheistic naturalistic view of the world. Dr. diCarlo adds, but on an atheistic view, you don't need the divine reward in order to do good. I didn't say you did. That wasn't my argument. My argument was that in the absence of a transcendent locus of moral value that transcends sociocultural relativism, then there is no objective moral value. It's just a product of sociobiological evolution. Thirdly, I argued that if there is no God, there's no ultimate purpose in life. Everything is doomed to destruction in the heat death of the universe. And all of our activities until then are just like shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. Ultimately, they are inconsequential. And thus, if there is no God, it seems to me really quite indisputable that it makes an enormous difference that God does not exist. There's no ultimate meaning, value, or purpose. I then went on to argue, however, that one cannot live consistently and happily within the framework of such a worldview. And here I thought Dr. diCarlo's responses bore out the truth of what I said. He said, for example, it doesn't matter whether God exists or not. I'll try to make things a little better. Now notice on atheism, there is no content to the notion of a little better. There is no such thing as better or worse. All there is moral change, but you cannot say there is moral progress. Richard Taylor, who is an eminent ethicist, writes, "The infanticide practiced by the Greeks of antiquity did not violate their customs. If we say it was nevertheless wrong, we are only saying it was forbidden by our ethical and legal rules. And the abominations practiced by the Nazis are forbidden by our rules, but obviously not by theirs." The point is that you can have moral change, but moral progress is impossible on a naturalistic view because there is no content of better or worse. And then notice the leap to the upper story, that he cannot remain in the world without value. He says, for example, that he'll try to make life a little better by acting compassionately. He condemns George Bush for invading foreign lands for their natural resources and killing lots of people. You see, all of these are moral judgments. The atheist cannot live consistently and happily as though it's all right for people to invade foreign lands and slaughter their people for oil. He wants to say that certain things are really wrong or really right. He wants to give charitably to help the Maasai people of Africa, for example, to better the lot of the peoples of Africa. Why? Because that is a good moral thing to do. But that represents that leap from the lower to the upper story, which is totally unjustified on an atheistic, naturalistic worldview. Only if God exists can we live both consistently and happily within the framework of our view. Paul Kurtz, who is a humanist philosopher, has said with respect to moral nihilism, and I quote, "No one can consistently live his or her life under the domination of such an attitude." I would qualify Kurtz's remark. I would say, yes, you can perhaps live consistently, but if you do, you will be profoundly unhappy and depressed. Since that is difficult to do, it is more likely that you will make a leap to the upper story and you will choose to affirm meaning, value, and purpose in life, even though you have no right to, because on naturalism, these things do not exist. Finally, let me just comment that I am not claiming absolute certainty with some sort of a private insight to reality. When I argue for God's existence, I do so on the basis of philosophical and scientific arguments that are open to inspection and are probabilistically based. Dr. diCarlo says, I wish we could come up with a logical proof of God. Well, why does he wish that? Because it matters. It matters tremendously if God exists. And that's the burden of all that I'm trying to prove tonight. I'm not trying to prove that God exists tonight. That will be my burden tomorrow night at the University of Toronto, and I would invite you to join us for that debate if you can.